There is a highway in northwestern Canada, Highway 16, that stretches 724 kilometers through some of the most remote wilderness on Earth. The nearest town can be 100 kilometers away. Cell service disappears for hours at a time. And along this road, stretching back more than 50 years, women and girls have been vanishing. The local indigenous communities gave it a name that needs no explanation. They call it the Highway of Tears. As of today, the RCMP officially lists 18 cases connected to this corridor. Indigenous community organizations say the real number is closer to 40, possibly higher. Most cases remain unsolved. Almost all of the victims share one thing in common: they were Indigenous women. And for decades, that fact alone determined how seriously their disappearances were investigated. To understand the Highway of Tears, you first need to understand the geography. Highway 16 runs east to west across northern British Columbia, connecting the city of Prince George to Prince Rupert on the Pacific coast. Along its 724 kilometers, there are very few towns, and those that exist are small, economically isolated, and separated from each other by vast stretches of wilderness where a person could disappear in seconds and not be found for years. For the indigenous communities along this corridor, including the Wet'suwet'en, Gitxsan, Carrier, and others, the highway is not a convenience, it is a necessity. There is no reliable public transportation on this route. For a young woman needing to travel between communities, to visit family, to access medical care, to get to school, hitchhiking is not a choice made lightly. It is often the only option. This is not a story about poor decisions. It is a story about a system that left people with no other options on a road where no one was watching for 50 years. The first disappearance officially linked to the Highway of Tears corridor was in 1969, when Gloria Moody went missing near Terrace. She was never found. Cases followed in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Some resolved, most not. The cases that drew significant public attention came in rapid succession in the late 1980s and 1990s. Ramona Wilson, 16, disappeared in June 1994 near Smithers. Her remains were found the following spring near the local airport. Roxanne Thiara, 15, disappeared in 1994. Alicia Germain, 15, disappeared in 1994. Lana Derrick, 19, disappeared in 1995 near Terrace and has never been found. Nicole Haar, 25, one of the few non-Indigenous victims, disappeared in 2002 and has never been found. Isla Sarek Auger, 14, disappeared in 2006. Her remains were found along the highway 2 months later. Each of these cases was investigated individually. No sustained, coordinated investigation connecting them was launched for decades. Community members and family advocates began speaking publicly about the pattern long before any official body acknowledged it existed. In 2006, a Highway of Tears symposium was held in Prince George, the first formal gathering bringing together Indigenous community leaders, family members, law enforcement, and government officials to address the crisis collectively. The symposium produced 33 recommendations. Among them, improved transportation infrastructure so women would not need to hitchhike, increased RCMP resources dedicated to the corridor, better communication between detachments, and culturally appropriate support services for families of the missing. As of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which concluded in 2019, the majority of those recommendations had not been fully implemented. The National Inquiry itself, which ran from 2016 to 2019, was a landmark undertaking. It heard testimony from over 2,300 family members, survivors, and witnesses. Its final report, released in June 2019,
used a specific word to describe what had happened to Indigenous women and girls in Canada over generations. That word was genocide. The report made 231 individual calls for justice. Implementation has been partial and contested. The highway has not stopped taking people.
What is perhaps the most important part of this story, and the part that gets the least attention, is not the failures of institutions. It is the persistence of families. For decades, the mothers and sisters and aunts and grandmothers of the missing women on Highway 16 conducted their own searches. They organized their own tip lines. They drove the highway themselves, asking questions in towns where police had already closed or deprioritized files. Matilda Wilson, Ramona Wilson's mother, became one of the most prominent advocates for missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canadian history, speaking publicly for over 2 decades. Brenda Wilson, Ramona's sister, has continued that work. The families of the highway built networks of communication, shared information across communities, and ultimately forced the issue onto the national agenda through sheer refusal to accept silence. The national inquiry exists in large part because of them. The partial reforms that have occurred exist because of them. They did the work that should have been done by institutions because the institutions did not do it. They are still doing it. The RCMP's E-PANA task force, established in 2005 specifically to investigate Highway of Tears cases, has over the years linked 9 cases to a single unidentified suspect through forensic evidence. That suspect has never been identified. DNA evidence exists. A profile exists. The person it belongs to has not been found. In 2019, British Columbia committed funding for an Indigenous-led cold case review unit. Community organizations continue to push for full implementation of the National Inquiry's 231 calls for justice. The BC government has committed in principle to a number of specific infrastructure improvements along the corridor: better cell coverage, improved transit options, some of which have been partially completed. As of this recording, at least a dozen cases along the Highway 16 corridor remain officially unsolved. The families of the missing are still waiting. The highway is still there, and the conditions that made it dangerous, isolation, inadequate infrastructure, systemic gaps in how missing persons cases involving Indigenous women are prioritized, have been acknowledged in official reports by multiple governments at multiple levels. Acknowledgement and action are not the same thing.
The Highway of Tears is not a horror story in the way we usually use that phrase. It is not a mystery with a satisfying resolution waiting at the end. It is an ongoing crisis with known causes, documented failures, and living families who are still asking questions that have never been adequately answered. Ramona Wilson was 16 when she disappeared. Lana Derrick was 19. Aila Sarek Auger was 14. They had families who lived them. They had futures. They were on a road they had no other way to travel because the infrastructure that everyone else took for granted had never been built for them. If you take one thing from this video, I'd ask that it be this. The scariest thing about the Highway of Tears is not the darkness on either side of the road. It is the fact that everyone in a position to change the conditions that created it knew. For decades, they knew. Reports were written, recommendations were made, families testified, and the highway kept taking people. The question that remains open is not just who did this, it is who allowed the conditions that made it possible, and what we are willing to do so that no family ever has to drive that road looking for someone who should have been able to travel it safely. If you have information on any Highway of Tears case, the RCMP Tip Line is 1-877-543-4822. It is listed in the description. Please share this video. These families deserve to be heard.